Is this your office? My cousin laughed, holding up the photo on his phone. A plastic chair, a second-hand desk, and one broken fan. Wow, big businessmen. The whole dinner table burst into laughter. That night, sitting at the long family table, I felt every pair of eyes on me. Some were amused. Some were judging. None of them knew the truth. And none of them knew that in less than a year, my name would be on the lease of the very building they were sitting in. It started at my uncle's birthday dinner. The entire family was there: cousins, aunts, uncles, even distant relatives who only showed up when there was good food and better gossip. My cousin Hamza leaned back in his chair smirking. "So, what do you actually do all day?" he asked loudly. "Last I heard, you rented a tiny room above a mechanic shop and called it an office." Someone across the table chuckled. Another cousin added, "Yeah, I saw it too. Bro, my storage room is bigger than that place." More laughter. My aunt shook her head dramatically. "Why don't you just join your uncle's business? At least you'd have a real job." I stayed quiet. My mother looked uncomfortable beside me. I could see it in her eyes. She hated when they talked to me like that. Hamza wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and showed a picture to everyone at the table. "Look at this," he said. "This is his company headquarters." The photo showed exactly what they were laughing about: a tiny office with peeling paint, one cheap desk, and a plastic chair. More laughter. "Bro," Hamza said between chuckles, "this isn't an office. This is a waiting room for disappointment." Everyone laughed again, everyone except my grandfather. He was sitting quietly at the end of the table, watching me carefully. "So," Hamza continued, leaning closer, "tell us honestly, how much rent do you even pay for that place?" $200, I said calmly. That made it even worse. "200, my uncle said. "That's not an office, that's a closet." My cousin Sarah smirked. "You know this building alone costs more than that per hour, right?" She tapped the table proudly. The restaurant we were sitting in wasn't just any restaurant. It was inside the newest luxury business tower in the city, the building my uncle always bragged about. His company occupied 2 floors there. "Real business happens in places like this," Hamza said, gesturing around the elegant hall. "Not in a room above a mechanic." I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said quietly. They thought I was agreeing with them. They didn't notice the small smile I tried to hide, because what they didn't know was that the mechanic shop downstairs was the reason my office was so cheap. And what they didn't know was who the real owner of this entire building was. A few minutes later, the waiter came to our table with the bill folder. My uncle picked it up confidently. "Put it on the company account," he said. The waiter hesitated. "Sir, the account has been updated." My uncle frowned. "What do you mean updated?" The waiter looked slightly nervous and glanced toward me for a split second before answering. "It means," he said slowly, "the new leaseholder approved the billing changes this morning." The table went quiet. My uncle looked confused. "What new leaseholder?" The waiter opened the folder and turned it around so my uncle could see the page inside. At first, my uncle didn't react. Then his eyes narrowed. Then his face slowly changed color. Hamza leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" My uncle didn't answer. He was staring at one single line printed clearly at the top of the document. And when Hamza finally saw the name written there, his smile disappeared, because the name listed as the new primary leaseholder of the entire building was mine. For a moment, nobody said a word. Hamza blinked twice, like his brain was trying to correct what his eyes had just seen. "Wait, that's not possible," he said slowly. My uncle looked at me, then back at the paper, then back at me again. This must be a mistake," he muttered. The waiter shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, the building management sent updated documents to all tenants this afternoon." My aunt leaned forward. "Updated documents for what?" My uncle didn't answer her. His eyes were still locked on the paper. Finally, he pushed the folder toward Hamza. "Read it?" Hamza grabbed it quickly. His lips moved silently as he read the line again. Then he laughed, but the laugh sounded forced. "Oh, come on," he said. "Someone's playing a joke." He turned to me. "You put your name on some fake document and think we'll believe you own this building." I calmly took a sip of water. "I never said I owned it." "Then what is this?" he snapped, pointing at the paper. Before I could answer, my grandfather spoke for the first time that evening. His voice was calm, but firm. "Let him talk." The table went quiet again. I placed the glass down and leaned back in my chair. "You're right about one thing," I said. "I don't own the building." My cousin Sarah smirked. "See, I told you." "But," I continued, "I do control the master lease." Their expressions froze again. Hamza frowned. "The what?" "The master lease," I repeated. My uncle's face suddenly looked worried. He understood what that meant. "You're lying," Hamza said quickly. But my uncle didn't laugh this time. He was staring at me very carefully. "How did you get it?" he asked quietly. That question made everyone look at him. "What?" Sarah said. "You're actually taking this seriously." My uncle ignored her. His eyes stayed on me. Because he knew something the others didn't. The building owner had been trying to sell the master lease rights for months. Most companies didn't want the risk. It meant taking responsibility for managing all tenant agreements. But it also meant controlling them. And my uncle suddenly realized something. "Who financed it?" he asked slowly. Hamza scoffed. "Why are you asking him like he's some big investor?" But my uncle still didn't look away from me. I smiled slightly. You remember that tiny office above the mechanic shop? I said. Hamza rolled his eyes. Yeah, the one we all laughed at. That mechanic, I said calmly, owns the land behind 3 apartment complexes and half the warehouses near the highway. Silence. He doesn't like banks, I continued. He prefers investing with people he trusts. Sarah frowned. What does that have to do with anything? I looked at her. For the last 2 years, I said, my tiny office has been managing his property contracts. My uncle slowly leaned back in his chair. Understanding was beginning to form on his face. You built a management company, he said quietly. Exactly. Hamza shook his head. Okay, so you manage some parking lots. That doesn't explain this. I tapped the document lightly. The building owner needed someone to take over the master lease. I said, someone who could manage all tenant contracts and maintenance agreements. My aunt laughed nervously. So what? They picked you? I shrugged. No. I offered, and they said yes. Hamza said. I nodded. That's impossible. He replied instantly, but my uncle interrupted him. What were the terms? He asked me. I could see the tension in his face now. 15-year master lease. I said. My aunt's fork dropped onto her plate. 15 years? She whispered. And the rent? My uncle asked. Reduced? I said simply. Hamza laughed again. You expect us to believe you suddenly control this entire building. Before I could respond, the restaurant manager approached our table. He looked nervous. Excuse me, sir, he said politely to my uncle. Yes? My uncle replied. The manager glanced at me briefly. Building administration asked me to inform you that tomorrow morning's tenant meeting has been moved to Conference Hall A. My uncle frowned. Why? The manager hesitated. Then he said something that made the entire table freeze again. Because the new lease director will be attending. Slowly, very slowly, his eyes moved toward me. And they asked that all tenants arrive 15 minutes early. My cousin Sarah whispered, Lease director. Hamza looked confused. My uncle's voice came out tight. You're telling me, he said slowly to the manager, that he is running the tenant meeting tomorrow. The manager nodded politely. Yes, sir. Then he looked at me respectfully. We'll have the conference room prepared for you. Hamza pushed his chair back slightly. This is ridiculous. But my uncle didn't speak. He was staring at me the same way someone stares at a puzzle when the final piece suddenly appears. 2 years, he murmured. What? My aunt asked. He's been doing this for 2 years. My uncle said quietly. My grandfather finally smiled faintly. I wondered when you'd notice. Everyone turned toward him. You knew? Sarah asked. My grandfather looked at me calmly. I didn't know the details, he said, but I knew he wasn't wasting his time. Hamza still looked unconvinced. You expect us to believe you went from a plastic chair office to controlling a billion-dollar building. I leaned forward slightly. You laughed at the office, I said, because it was small. I paused. But small offices don't scare people? Hamza frowned. What does that mean? It means, I said calmly, no one notices what you're building until it's already finished. My uncle suddenly closed the folder slowly. Then he asked the one question nobody else at the table had thought to ask yet. And what happens, he said carefully, to tenants who fall behind on their payments? The table became silent again, because everyone knew the answer mattered. I looked directly at him, and then I said quietly, that depends on the contract they signed. My uncle's fingers tightened on the edge of the table, because in that moment, he remembered exactly what his company's lease contract said. My uncle's fingers slowly loosened from the edge of the table, but the tension in his face didn't disappear. In fact, it got worse. Hamza looked between us, confused. Why are you both acting like this is some big deal? He asked. It's just a lease. My uncle didn't answer him. He was still staring at me. Tell me something, he said quietly. What? I replied. Did you read every tenant contract in this building? I didn't even hesitate. Yes? The word landed on the table like a stone dropped in water. My aunt shifted in her chair. Why would that matter? My uncle slowly exhaled. Because, he said, this building has one of the strictest commercial lease structures in the city. Sarah frowned. Meaning, he looked at her. Meaning if a tenant violates certain clauses, the lease controller can take action. Hamza rolled his eyes. So what? That happens everywhere. But my uncle wasn't smiling. What kind of action? Sarah asked. My uncle looked down at the paper again. Then he said something that made the air feel heavier. Rent restructuring. My aunt blinked. Is that bad? My uncle let out a short, humorless laugh. It can double the rent. The table fell silent. Hamza scoffed again, but his voice wasn't as confident now. Okay, but why would he do that to us? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the waiter who was still standing nearby. You can close the bill, I told him. He nodded politely. Of course, sir. Sir, that single word made Hamza's jaw tighten. When the waiter walked away, my aunt leaned closer to me. So, you're really serious about all this? I shrugged slightly. I just signed a contract. But why didn't you tell anyone? Sarah asked. I looked at her calmly. Would anyone here have believed me? No one spoke, because they all knew the answer. Hamza shifted in his chair. You still haven't explained something, he said. What? I asked. How you suddenly had the money to take control of something this big? I leaned back slightly. You're assuming I used my own money? My uncle's eyes narrowed. Then whose? I tapped the table lightly. Investors? Hamza laughed. What investors would trust you with a deal like that? I met his gaze calmly, the kind who don't care about appearances. My grandfather chuckled softly. That sounds about right. Sarah looked puzzled. Wait, how big is this deal exactly? My uncle answered before I could. Too big for someone with a plastic chair office? He muttered. Then he looked at me again. You negotiated directly with the building owner. Yes. And they agreed to this arrangement. Yes. Hamza shook his head. This is insane. But my uncle suddenly leaned forward. And the security deposit? The question made my mother look at me nervously, because she knew something no one else at the table knew. For a moment, I stayed quiet. Then I said, covered? Be who? Hamza asked immediately. I looked at him. The same mechanic you all laughed about. Sarah's eyes widened. You're serious. I nodded. Hamza let out a long breath. So a mechanic just decided to help you control a luxury tower. Not help? I corrected. Partner. That word changed the mood instantly. My uncle slowly rubbed his temples. How much control do you actually have? He asked. I answered honestly. Enough? Enough for what? To enforce the contracts. Hamza leaned forward. And you would actually do that? To family. The question hung in the air. I looked at him carefully. You didn't seem worried about family when you were laughing 10 minutes ago. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My aunt suddenly spoke. But surely you wouldn't do something extreme? Like what? I asked. Like raising someone's rent? I didn't answer her. Instead, I picked up the bill folder that the waiter had just brought back. Inside was a printed receipt. I slid it slowly across the table toward my uncle. He looked down at it, his eyebrows slowly pulled together. What is this? Updated billing, I said. For tonight's dinner? Hamza leaned over again. Let me see. He read the numbers, then he frowned. Wait, why is the company discount removed? My uncle looked up at me sharply. Company accounts were revised this morning, I said calmly. But this restaurant is under our corporate agreement, he replied. Not anymore, I said. Silence fell again. Sarah whispered, You, I shook my head slightly. I didn't cancel anything. Then what happened? Hamza asked. I met his eyes. The contract expired. My uncle's voice became very quiet. That renewal was scheduled next month. Yes, I said. And the renewal terms changed. Hamza crossed his arms. So what? It's just a restaurant discount. My uncle slowly placed the receipt back on the table. No, he said quietly. It's not. Everyone looked at him and he looked at me again. What are the new terms? I paused for a moment, just long enough for the tension to grow. Then I said, tenants renewing commercial agreements now have to comply with the updated lease policy. Sarah looked confused. What policy? My uncle didn't ask that question, because he already knew. His voice came out tight. You added the performance clause. I didn't respond. That silence was enough. Hamza frowned. What performance clause? My uncle slowly leaned back in his chair. Then he looked at Hamza. The clause that allows the lease controller. He stopped speaking for a moment. Then he finished the sentence. To review the financial stability of every tenant company. Sarah looked shocked. And if the company isn't stable? My uncle's eyes stayed on me. Then the lease controller can request a renegotiation. Hamza blinked. Renegotiation of what? My uncle answered quietly. Everything. The table went completely silent again. Because at that moment, everyone realized something. My uncle's company had been losing money for months. And now, the person who controlled whether their lease stayed the same or changed completely was sitting right across the table from them. For a few seconds, no one at the table moved. Even the background noise of the restaurant suddenly felt distant. Hamza looked at my uncle, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to say this was all some misunderstanding. But my uncle didn't laugh. He slowly rubbed his forehead, the way he did whenever he was calculating something complicated in his head. You reviewed the tenant reports already, he said quietly. It wasn't a question, I nodded once. Sarah's voice came out almost as a whisper. Reports about what? My uncle answered without looking at her. About every company renting space in this building. My aunt shifted nervously. But that information is private. I looked at her calmly. Not to the master leaseholder. Hamza leaned back in his chair. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, he said. Even if you control the lease, you wouldn't actually mess with our company? I raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because we're family, he said quickly. The irony in his voice almost made me smile. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my grandfather quietly cleared his throat. Family, he repeated slowly. Everyone turned toward him. He looked at Hamza, then at my uncle, then at the rest of the table. Tell me something, he said calmly. When he started his business, how many of you supported him? Silence. Sarah looked down at her plate. My aunt avoided eye contact. Hamza shifted uncomfortably. My grandfather continued. How many of you encouraged him? Still nothing. Then he looked at my uncle. And how many times did you tell him to quit and work for you instead? My uncle didn't answer, but his expression said enough. The old man finally looked at me. And how many times did they laugh at you? I shrugged slightly. Enough times. Hamza tried to defend himself. Come on, we were just joking. I looked at him. You took pictures of my office and showed them to everyone. His mouth closed again. My grandfather nodded slowly. Words matter, he said, even when people pretend they don't. My uncle leaned forward again. Let's stop pretending this dinner is about feelings, he said firmly. This is business now. I nodded. Correct. He folded his hands together. What are you planning to do with the lease policy? My mother looked nervous beside me. She hated conflict, especially inside the family. But this moment had been building for years. Hamza spoke again. You're not actually going to raise our rent, right? His voice wasn't confident anymore. It sounded worried. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the table, at the same faces that had laughed earlier, at the same people who had turned my hard work into a joke. Then I said quietly, your company currently occupies 2 full floors. My uncle nodded slowly. Wes! And according to the latest financial report, I continued, your revenue dropped 23% last quarter. Hamza's eyes widened. How do you know that? I ignored the question. The performance clause gives the lease director the right to reassess high-risk tenants. My uncle leaned forward. So reassess us? My aunt whispered, wait. But he raised his hand to stop her. If you're going to do something, he said to me, just say it. The table felt tense enough to snap. Finally, I spoke. The new lease terms could increase your monthly rent by 40%. Sarah gasped softly. Hamza looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. 40%, he said. My uncle stayed quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. That would destroy our profit margin. Yes, I said. Another silence filled the table. Hamza leaned forward urgently. Okay, look, if this is about the jokes earlier. It's not. I interrupted calmly. Then what is it about? He asked. I met his eyes. Respect? My grandfather smiled faintly, but my uncle suddenly did something unexpected. He stood up. Everyone looked at him. For a moment I thought he was angry, but instead he did something no one at that table expected. He walked around the table and stopped beside my chair. Then he extended his hand. I was wrong, he said quietly. The entire table froze. Hamza's mouth literally fell open. You built something real? My uncle continued, and I didn't see it. His hand was still extended. I underestimated you. I looked at his hand for a moment. Then I stood up and shook it. The tension in the room eased slightly. Hamza looked confused. Wait, that's it, he said. You're just shaking hands. My uncle looked at him. Sometimes that's harder than fighting. Sarah exhaled slowly. So what happens now? I sat back down. Then I picked up the lease folder again. I'll tell you what happens now, I said. Everyone leaned closer. The performance clause allows me to renegotiate the rent. Hamza swallowed, but it doesn't force me to. The table went quiet again. My uncle watched me carefully. You're giving us a choice? I nodded. Wes, what choice? He asked. I closed the folder. The same choice every business owner gets. Hamza leaned forward again, and that is. I looked at all of them one last time. You can keep laughing at the kid with the plastic chair. I paused. Or you can start treating him like a partner. Silence filled the table. Then my grandfather began to clap softly, one slow clap, then another. He smiled proudly. That, he said, is how real success talks. My uncle nodded respectfully. Sarah looked thoughtful. Even Hamza finally lowered his eyes. And for the first time that night, no one at the table was laughing anymore.